Our first presenter is Adam Bly. I met Adam Bly about a year ago, maybe a little more than a year ago, when he was in touch with me. He was trying to persuade me to join an advisory board for a new magazine that he was proposing to launch, and his big idea was that science somehow had gotten away from the mainstream of popular culture. It was considered something extremely abstruse, rarefied, and he wanted to bring a fresh new approach to the telling of science in a journalistic form. And his idea was to make science sexy. He was onto something because last year, you know, the ladies voted, and it was the scientists who were voted the hunks of the year. We'll take a poll later on in this meeting. And so Adam's idea was somehow to bring science into a more popular mainstream, and he showed me a kind of mock-up in which there were a lot of fashion photographs and one or two little statements and epigrams about science, and when he came to see me, I rejected it. I said, hey, Adam, too much fashion, not enough science. Well, he sure listened, and in no time at all, Seed, the magazine that he started, and which I trust is out there in the lobby and that you really should pick up, has made a real place for itself. Adam's a raging, precocious guy who has moved some of his offices down to the United States. He's publishing 250,000 copies per issue now, and I'd like him to come up and talk to you. Adam Bly. Do you want to sit? Or
No, I'm going to use presentation later. I'll answer it later.
Okay, well then I'll leave you to it.
Okay, thank you.
I'll take my stuff away.
So it's one of my greatest regrets that I don't play any of these. Thank you, Moses. So I want to talk about science today. You can go to the first slide, actually. I don't want to talk about one breakthrough in particular. I'm not talking about one scientist in particular or one trend in science in particular, or any one article we've done or any one magazine or any one particular issue. What I'd like to talk about is science is something bigger than that. Science is something bigger than something that comes out of a lab. Science is something bigger than something you read on page 1 of all of our newspapers. Something that is an idea, something that's a philosophy, something that for many is a religion, is a community, is a brand, and is a stream of media, no doubt. Before I go into the kind of realizations we were making a couple years ago when this was an idea to launch this type of magazine, I want to take you through a couple of the headlines in the past year and sort of take the pulse of our culture, take the pulse of our conversation in North America at large, and many of these issues transcend North America and extend to Europe and abroad, and go through that a little bit and talk about our conversation and talk about our culture, and then sort of look at the media's coverage of that. And at that point, you'll get a sense of where entrepreneurship figures into all this and into this story. So let's go back to the beginning of the year, and let's just look at some of the headlines just to refresh your memory so you get a sense of how significant science is in our culture today. Began the year with Raël. Began the year with the story of Brigitte Brosselier, who came out, it was around Christmas, and she came out and said, you know, we've cloned a human being. Which through a press conference in Hollywood, Florida. The media assembled in Florida, and it was page 1 headlines. This is all we were talking about for a number of weeks. We still don't know where the weapons of mass destruction are, and we just came out of a war. We went to war in part because of the existence of a new form of weapon, the fear of a new form of weapon, the attributes of a new form of weapon. Nuclear, biological, chemical weapons, weapons of mass destruction. This became a new part of our lexicon in the past year. This is an issue that's always there, genetically modified foods. Figuring in the dialogue in the United States, in the EU, in Canada, of course. We talked about it earlier, we heard about it earlier today in terms of wheat and the implications that might have. Of course, the Columbia disaster, dominating our news cycle for a good week. And putting into question space exploration, what could come from space, should we go into space? Global warming, always, always, always part of the news cycle lately. The Kyoto Protocol, always part of the news cycle. What will President Bush do? What legislation will be passed instead of Kyoto? What is the position of Canada? What is the position of Russia? What is the position of the G8 relative to Kyoto and relative to global warming? Of course, the SARS story, a new emerging global epidemic of particular relevance here. Our culture is changing as well. So not only are we looking, if you take a snapshot of page one, you take a page one from the Globe and Mail, the National Post, from the New York Times, or from Le Monde over the past 12 months, and these stories will invariably figure into page one. Similarly, if we look at the cultural landscape, arts, entertainment, celebrity, Hollywood, Broadway, and so on and so forth, we're seeing the same level of integration of science into our culture. This is a new study that just came out from the National Science Foundation. More Americans, and unfortunately a lot of these statistics are to do with the United States, many of them do apply, some of them don't to Canada. Let me get that out of the way. A new study by the National Science Foundation looking at the news we follow in the United States. Science has never been so high in terms of public interest. We follow science news more than we follow arts, more than we follow entertainment, more than we follow business, more than we follow politics. So after God, life, and death, and the Super Bowl, there's science. The #1 show in America is a show driven by forensic science. The #3 show in America is a spin-off of a #1 show based on forensic science. This is last week. The top books in the country, the books figuring on the New York Times bestseller list, coming from authors like Michael Crichton and Matt Ridley and Steven Pinker and Brian Greene and Laurie Garrett and Stephen Jay Gould. These are books hitting the New York Times bestseller list, staying on the New York Times bestseller list. This is what we're reading now. In Hollywood, the best picture last year was A Beautiful Mind, a film driven by the central character being a mathematician. Similarly, on Broadway, we're seeing the same kind of premise with Proof, winning Best Play, the Tony for Best Play. Again, a story centered around mathematics. We're seeing science and art come together unlike ever before at top galleries, at top museums around the world, and we'll see some brilliant photographs in this genre in the next couple of days. So we're seeing in the arts as well. So it's not surprising that then when you take the pulse, 90% of adults are interested in science. So that's exciting. That's great. That's an all-time high. Science, public interest in science has never been so high. But 15% of adults feel well informed about science. So the pace, our interest in science is far outpacing our knowledge of science, is far outpacing our ability to discuss science intelligently, is far outpacing the debate, the level of debate around the world about these very important issues driving our culture, driving our conversation today. Here's some of the problems. This is where it comes from, I think. A couple years ago, I went into a grade 1 classroom, and I asked a group of about 37-year-olds. I gave them pen, I gave them paper and crayons, and asked them to draw a scientist. And lo and behold, 30 minutes later, you come out, and you've got that same image. And it's the image that you'd imagine. It's the elderly man with frizzy hair and tape around the glasses and the lab coat. In some sort of, contained environment, a lab, there's always, 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 invariably that bubbling purple potion somewhere in the back. And I spent many years in a lab, and I promise you there aren't any of those. So that's #1. If we look at the image, we look at our public perception, even at a young age, of what a scientist is, who a scientist is. Now, this is terribly superficial, so I'm not going to leave it there. We'll keep going. This has become something I've become terribly passionate about lately. I just wrote a letter, one of my letters from the editor in the magazine about. You pick up a newspaper, and you look at a science story, and almost invariably, the lead will contain the phrase, scientists have recently. Scientists at MIT have recently. Scientists at the National Research Council have recently. My problem with this is that, what is that? as if there's one sort of image, there's one community, there's one group, they did it. Over there, they did it. Doesn't matter what their names are, doesn't matter where they come from, doesn't matter their religious biases, doesn't matter what they think about abortion. They did it, them, over at MIT. That's figuring into our headlines. This is how we're reading headlines in science, as the scientists over there have done this. I recently sat down with John Marburger, who is, President Bush has a science advisor. His name is John Marburger. And he said this to me: cloning is not a science issue. I want to keep the science recommendations aimed at the president separated from the ethics recommendations. Now, I started a whole conversation with Dr. Marburger that I fundamentally disagree with this premise. You cannot separate science and ethics, and you cannot separate science from politics and science from popular culture. They influence each other, and now more than ever before. And yet this is the spirit in Washington at the moment. This is the person who's advising the president every day about issues related to science. If we look at scrutiny aimed at Martha Stewart right now in the United States, and we compare that and the amount of information, the amount of time and energy that's spent scrutinizing something like that, something so small and minute, like lying to the SEC, relative to Stephen Hatfill, who is the person of interest, the only person of interest who's been made public, who's been named as a person of interest, as a so-called suspect, as a suspect in the anthrax investigations, as the first bioterrorist attack on US soil in history. We know nothing about Stephen Hatfill. We know nothing about where he comes from. We know nothing about the true story of who potentially is the source of the anthrax attacks, whether you believe it or not. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So there's something wrong with that as well. When Brigitte Brosselier came out and cloning was everywhere, and Raël came on, and it's not about the aliens, it's not about the aliens aren't coming to clone, it's a whole different thing, Raël just funds it. This is how the most credible news organization in the world, arguably on television, one of, certainly, covered it on their in prime time that night. So you had the same anchor, Anderson Cooper, who's an excellent anchor otherwise, Anderson Cooper 1, Anderson Cooper 2. And Anderson Cooper 1 would talk to Anderson Cooper 2, and Anderson Cooper 1 would answer Anderson Cooper 2. And this would go on and on and on, and this was the news. This is how it was covered. And other shows as well, and other channels on Fox News as well, and other networks as well. Can you imagine if this was anything but a cloning issue? Can you imagine if this was a business story, and they came on the air primetime dressed up as the CEOs, or they came on dressed up as politicians? This is how we interpreted science. And then forever, we are now associating aliens and the Raëlian cult with human cloning. And so you had people come on the news media during this period. This was a big problem because there are two types, of course, of cloning. There's two types of very different streams of reproductive cloning and therapeutic cloning. And there are very few people who challenge the possibilities that might come, what might come from therapeutic cloning. But this certainly had an impact on public perception of what human cloning was all about. And of course, this is how we respond to bioterrorism. So you go to Home Depot and you pick up a roll of duct tape and plastic sheeting. 1 in 5 Americans bought disinfectant to cure SARS. More Americans went out to go buy duct tape. The Chinese were throwing their pets out of windows. Again, there's something wrong here. Now let's look at the newsstand. This is the infamous dinosaur cover. I have a problem with the dinosaur cover, and I have a problem with science magazines in general. And I won't speak too much to this, because I don't want to spend too much time on what other people are doing wrong. But, importantly, the dinosaur cover is the face of science magazines and is the face of science. The medium is the message. More Americans are picking up in their 40s, are picking up Discover and Scientific American to get their science information. People who already have a cultivated passion in science, who are somewhat interested, studied some science in college, studied some science in university, and now turn to these magazines for their source of science. The problem is that the image and the content produced and distributed by these types of magazines is extremely vertical and speaks exclusively to science at the expense of presenting science in a larger context. How is science affecting our culture? How is science affecting our conversation? Who is behind all of this? What are the controversies? What are the issues? Where is the debate? As opposed to, what really killed the dinosaurs. They've run 3 dinosaur covers over the course of the last 12 months. What really killed them this time? And just importantly, as a little note to keep in the back of your head, the average person buying these magazines is about 45 and is about 75, 70-something% male. So that's who's picking up science magazines. Our culture is changing, our conversation is changing, our media is not. And the result is that by perpetuating this image of this separate culture, C.P. Snow wrote this book several years ago called The Two Cultures. And in it, he laid out this notion of the artists and the humanities separated from the sciences, and never the two should meet. So you've got this isolated culture. You've got the scientists with the capital S in terms of who's discovering the science. You've got the images perpetuated in the magazines. You've got the Anderson Cooper 1, Anderson Cooper 2. You've got duct tape. And the result is a lack of dialogue about these issues. The result is a culture of panic. And the result is almost invariably poor decision-making. And if not poor decision-making, then as we saw, 15% of Americans knowing, well-informed about science, at least uninformed decision-making. And that's worse. So about 4 years ago now, I was in Budapest, and I was representing Canada. At the time, I was living in Montreal, and I was doing research with the National Research Council, working on cancer, working on cell adhesion molecules in cancer, how cells come together and come apart in cancer. And I was invited by the Canadian government to go represent Canada at the UNESCO World Conference on Science, which was this conference set up to look at how science was figuring into our culture at the turn of the century. How it was being reflected in the media, how it was driving the business cycles, how it was driving our conversation, what actually was happening in science, where were the breakthroughs coming from, what were the fields of science. And so on one hand, there was this conversation developing. There was this dialogue beginning to bubble. And on the other hand, a stagnant portrayal of science in large part in the popular media, and one based on stereotypes, and one not only deleterious to science, but I'd argue deleterious to popular culture at large. And so the question was, about 4 years ago, can we build a completely new type of science magazine? Can we build something which sets out to provoke dialogue, important, critical dialogue about these issues? Can we build something that rebrands science? Can we build something that presents scientists as the new establishment, as the new celebrity, as innovators, as forward thinkers, as the people with the most interesting ideas? Can we present the stories in science? Can we look to science for the most exciting, thought-provoking stories? And the answer was yes. And so it came back about 4 years ago, about 4.5 years ago, about 4 years ago, and then a year later, this started to bubble and it started to become an idea. And we've built that, and I'll leave that up for 2 seconds. The spirit with which we launched this magazine was to capture the spirit of our time, capture how science is profoundly impacting our culture, and communicate it to, importantly, a younger audience and a dual audience of men and women in all countries. And as we've built this magazine, we've really looked at 4 major facets of content And we've tried to present science as this an integrated presentation of science. We're looking at the issues we spoke about earlier. We're looking at popular culture. We're looking at how science is figuring into popular culture. We're looking at the icons. We're looking at this new establishment in science. And we're looking at the ideas. We're looking at the most mind-bending, thought-provoking ideas coming out of the sciences that are just exciting because. Not because there's going to be some technology that comes from them, but because they're just exciting, because they're thought-provoking, not because they tell us how our cell phones work. And we've assembled an extraordinary team, and I want to just leave that up there for 1 second. Some extraordinary writers who've worked with us, from Laurie Garrett, who's our editor-at-large, who's a Pulitzer Prize winner, to Paul Hoffman, who's the former editor-in-chief at Discover, to Michael Crichton. You can see an extraordinary list of writers who have come together, smart, provocative, loud contributors coming on board. And I want to speak to this for a second. We're a new magazine, and we're about 6 issues old. We've just put the 7th to bed. And I want to take you through a couple of the things we've done since we launched, and a little bit of the impact that we've had. Wan Yanhai is a Chinese AIDS activist who is imprisoned for releasing information for discussing the true state of AIDS in China. He was imprisoned. He disappeared for 30 days. We did the first interview with him when he was released. We critiqued the media's coverage of Clonade. We went on, we did a story, we wrote a column, we went on radio, we spoke about the column, we critiqued the media's coverage of human cloning. We've introduced João Maguejo, who is this up-and-coming physicist in the UK. We broke that story. We've introduced someone who's questioning if Einstein was right. What if Einstein was wrong? And that was picked up in numerous media outlets subsequent to our publication. Most interestingly, this just came out. Laurie Garrett, our editor-at-large, was in China covering the SARS outbreak. And many of you saw her on CBC. She was doing things for CBC. And when Laurie was on, talking about the public health crisis, the true state of SARS in China, she was on CNN. CNN International was censored for 8 minutes about a month ago when Laurie Garrett was on talking about the true state of public health in China. And on and on and on. We've introduced a new theory of memory. We've just presented a new play, which is hitting New York right now, centered in the spirit of Copenhagen and proof, called Humble Boy. So in all facets, we're trying to have this type of cultural impact. And the last one I want to speak to, because it's the one that is the cover story of the issue that will be outside, is about Stephen Hatfill. I mentioned it briefly. But Stephen Hatfill, who's the person of interest in the anthrax attacks, we just concluded an investigation, a really exciting story we just published. Turns out he, over the course of about 4 years, submitted about a dozen resumes to various labs in the United States and around the world, from South Africa to the UK, to the US, to Antarctica. Turns out all of them are fraudulent. Turns out everything, in large part, on his resumes, what he did, where he went, where he got his degree, did he get a degree, did he sit on a panel, incredible stuff, turns out is all fraudulent. And he was admitted to level 4 labs in the United States, where they keep anthrax and smallpox and plague and Ebola. And he's now the center of the anthrax investigations. That story had never been told before. Most people don't know who Stephen Hatfill is. Most people don't know what the names of the scientists are in Iraq, potentially developing weapons of mass destruction. We don't know their names. We don't care to know their names. We don't force them to come on television. We don't force our media organizations to address them by name. They are the scientists. And finally, last point, 50% of our readers are women. That's never happened before in science. The cultural implications, we hope this will be sustained, and we hope this will have phenomenal implications on the profile, the landscape of science, and our average reader is 32 versus an average reader of about 45. So this is a new generation. And finally, the vision long-term, where we go next. This is the most ambitious slide up there. But we've gone from music, we've gone to celebrity, we've gone to technology. Science is driving our culture today. We need to be better informed. We need to make better decisions. We need to have a stronger debate about these issues. We hope to be that magazine. Thank you.
Yum.